Growing up watching and practicing MMA, every kid's dream was to be in the UFC. Some kids got to achieve this dream, while others fell short. But for some of those who got to live this dream out, it didn't turn out exactly how they predicted. Injuries, controversial losses, or just business moves made by the UFC, these fighters have been unlucky in their time with the organization. Here in this video, I'll talk about 5 fighters with the most unfortunate UFC careers. Starting this video off, we got one of the best lightweights to ever fight, and that's Tony Ferguson. Nicknamed El Cucuy, the boogeyman Tony Ferguson was at the forefront of the UFC's top division at one point. The champ at the time, Conor McGregor, was out boxing looking for paychecks, while Khabib Nurmagomedov was out due to injury. On the cusp of it, and Ferguson is supposed to be the undisputed champ come UFC 223, Ferguson is forced to pull out due to a knee injury and was stripped of his interim lightweight title. Khabib becomes the undisputed champ against Al Iaquinta, and Tony Ferguson is expected to be the next guy to fight for the title, right? Wrong. Conor McGregor comes out the woodworks, demands his title shot against Khabib at UFC 229 after not fighting in MMA for 2 years, and Dana White gives it to him, completely brushing over Tony Ferguson in the process. What does Tony do about it? He does what he's been doing for the past 5 years and TKOs Anthony Pettis in the co-main event of UFC 229. Now it's Tony's time. No shot he gets injured again, and no chance Dana White screws him over again. The UFC finally books Ferguson vs Khabib for the 5th time at UFC 249, and for the 5th time, the bout is called off. COVID-19 hits the world, and Khabib has issues traveling to the United States, so Tony has to fight for an interim title again, but this time against Justin Gaethje. But lo and behold, 12-fight win streak. Everybody thinks Tony will be back to himself, but the champ Khabib knows otherwise.
It's like Tony Ferguson's time is finished, you know.
Tony faces future champ Charles Oliveira next and loses. Then Beneil Dariush, another loss. Then Michael Chandler gets his head kicked to the moon and loses again. Everybody's calling for Tony's retirement, but Tony still believes he has some left in the tank.
I got 5 fights in the title on my way.
Yeah. Are you where are you at in your career? Are you
I'm barely hitting my prime, which is crazy because I'm 39 years old.
He takes 3 more losses against Nate Diaz, Bobby Green, and Paddy Pimblett. From what was a 12-fight win streak, turned into a 7-fight losing streak, and the end of the boogeyman. From an outstanding record of 26-3 to 26-10. So many things went wrong for Tony Ferguson in the UFC, it sucks to see a legend like him never fight for an undisputed belt. What a shame. Next, we got someone who was supposed to be one of the most promising prospects we've ever seen come into the UFC, and that's Zabit Magomed. A lot of casuals are questioning who this guy is, but if you're a true fan of this sport, you know exactly who Zabit is. Zabit was an 18-1 featherweight fighting out of Dagestan, Russia. You hear Russia and you might think he was a grappling dominant fighter, but he was the exact opposite actually. He was a striker that was very crafty with his kicks and movement. His twitchy style mixed with unorthodox striking made him a problem for featherweights. He was ranked as high as number 3 among featherweights during his time. But what exactly happened? Zabit started his UFC career 4-0, and he was set to face Jeremy Stephens. During the fight, Zabit was dominating the first 2 rounds as usual, but it was what happened in the 3rd round that was surprising. Starting the 3rd round, it was clear that Zabit was slowing down tremendously, getting gassed out after the first 2 rounds. Still, Zabit was able to get a decision win, but fighters finally found the weakness in his game, his conditioning. After the Stephens fight, he was set to face Calvin Kattar in a UFC Fight Night main event. If you guys don't know, every single main event the UFC hosts are 5 rounds. However, Zabit and his management tell the UFC he can only go 3 rounds, so they make an exception and make the fight a 3-rounder. The same thing happens. Zabit dominates the first 2 rounds, but gasses out in the 3rd. Now this is super concerning. Zabit takes a break from fighting to address a clear health issue regarding his immune system. He gets a fight booked against Yair Rodriguez for the number 1 contender fight, but Zabit can't get healthy. Then, Zabit finally makes a tough decision and retires at 31 years old. We all wish to have seen more of Zabit Magomed, but fortunately, he's turned his life to help people and become a doctor instead of continuing to hurt people. What could have been? We come to fan favorite Chan Sung Jung, or better known as the Korean Zombie. Coming into the UFC from the WEC, the Korean Zombie got his nickname for constantly moving forward, He got 3 straight finishes in the UFC, including a submission win against Dustin Poirier, and then got a title shot against the featherweight GOAT at the time, Jose Aldo. He got knocked out in the 4th round, but this is where his unlucky stretch starts. Being from South Korea, they require males ages 18 to 35 to serve at least 2 years in the military. Jung made his announcement to serve his country in October of 2014, which seemed to be right in the middle of his prime. And because of pullouts in his required military service, Jung missed almost 4 years of his prime, not fighting until February 2017. He ended up getting another title shot against Alex Volkanovski, so I guess all is not bad. But who would know if the featherweight division turns out different if the Korean Zombie was there during his prime. 4th on my list, I got former bantamweight champ Dominick Cruz. I know what you guys are thinking. How can one of the best bantamweights of all time be with the most unfortunate UFC careers? Hear me out. Let me tell you his fight timeline. Cruz comes to the UFC from the WEC and wins the inaugural bantamweight championship against Uriah Faber. He then defends his title against arguably the most dominant fighter ever in Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson on October of 2011. Then, 5 years later, in 2016, he gets his bantamweight title back against TJ Dillashaw. He defends against Uriah Faber again, but loses the belt to Cody Garbrandt. All this happens in 2016. Then we come to 4 years later, and he loses a title fight to Henry Cejudo by knockout. So what happened to Cruz for him to miss 9 years of his prime? Cruz tore his ACL in May of 2012 and was forced to have surgery. Then to have another ACL surgery after his body rejected the first one. Then in February of 2014, Cruz tore his groin and finally vacated the bantamweight belt. He fights in 2014 against Takeya Mitsugaki, winning by knockout in the first round, but tore his ACL in his other knee, sidelining him for another 2 years. He has no issues for all of 2016, but after his fight against Cody Garbrandt, he said he dealt with tendonitis in his hands. He was supposed to fight in 2017, but he pulled out with a broken arm. Then he was supposed to fight in 2019, but he hurt a shoulder that sidelined him for another year. So let's recap this. Dominick Cruz suffered a torn ACL in both knees, tore his groin, tendonitis in his hand, broke his arm, and hurt his shoulder to keep him out of fights. Without these injuries, we talk about Dominick Cruz as the greatest bantamweight to ever live, and arguably one of the best fighters ever too. Maybe it just wasn't meant to be. Last but definitely not least, we got one of the current top light heavyweights in the UFC, and Magomed Ankalaev. Coming into the UFC, Ankalaev was a highly touted prospect expected to dominate once he made his debut, and dominate he did. He lost his first bout against Paul Craig, but after that he was destroying other fighters. Going on a 9-fight win streak with notable wins against Ian Cutelaba, Anthony Smith, and Thiago Santos, Ankalaev finally got a title shot against Jan Blachowicz for the vacant light heavyweight strap at UFC 282. At first glance, it looked like Magomed was finally going to be crowned after being known as the uncrowned champ for so long. But with blistering leg kicks from Jan and a bad decision by the judges in my opinion, the fight was ruled a draw. Magomed was upset at the decision, but that wasn't the only thing he was upset about.
I heard that Ankalaev is upset and whatever. What do you want me to do?
The question is, what do you do now, right? I mean, vacant title, a split.
You do Glover versus Jamal Hill in Brazil for the vacant title.
Is that done?
Done.
What seemed to be 30 minutes later, Dana White rings up Jamal Hill and Glover Teixeira and gets them to fight for the vacant light heavyweight title at UFC 283. Who was supposed to be the light heavyweight champ was completely brushed off in a matter of minutes by the company. After this, the UFC has Magomed fight a lesser-ranked fighter in Johnny Walker in order to keep his ranking. Unfortunately, that fight ended in no contest due to an eye poke from Ankalaev. Things get chippy after the fight between Walker and Ankalaev, so the UFC does what they do best. They book the big rivalry fights before anything else. Ankalaev is booked to fight Walker again, but this time finishes him in the second round. But let's take a closer look at this timeline. He dominates fighters for 4 years, and finally gets a title shot, but is screwed by a judge's decision. Then he's forced to fight a lower ranked opponent twice because the UFC didn't like how the first fight ended. And now, instead of being the #1 contender after doing everything the UFC has told him, the UFC is making the winner of Yuri and Rakic fight for the title next. I think Ankalaev is the best light heavyweight on the planet, and the fact that he's been screwed over by the UFC after so many occasions makes him one of the most unfortunate fighters. Let me know if I missed anybody in the comments. All that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe, and I'll talk to you guys later.